We are getting an update. A teenager accused of killing Anna Keaptainner on a cruise ship last year has been arrested. New documents are showing that her 16-year-old stepbrother, Timothy Hudson, turned himself in yesterday to U.S. Marshals.
What does it take for a federal judge to decide that someone can no longer remain free? Not suspicion, not rumors, not public outrage, evidence. And in the Timothy Hudson case, that evidence may have finally reached a tipping point. For more than 7 months, this case has raised the same troubling question. How could a teenager accused of killing his own stepsister remain outside a jail cell while waiting for trial? As investigators continued building their case, prosecutors quietly gathered surveillance footage, digital records, forensic findings, and witness statements. Piece by piece, they assembled what they believe happened aboard the Carnival Horizon cruise ship during a family vacation that ended in tragedy. Then came a decision that changed everything. A federal judge reviewed the evidence, examined the allegations, and ultimately concluded that Timothy Hudson should be taken into custody while awaiting trial. The ruling immediately reignited public interest in a case that was already drawing national attention. But what exactly convinced the court? Was it the surveillance footage showing Hudson's movements throughout the ship? Was it the digital trail investigators claim connected him to critical evidence? Or was it the growing collection of forensic findings that prosecutors believe tells a disturbing story about Anna Keaptainner's final hours? Tonight, we're breaking down the timeline, the evidence, and the courtroom developments that led to one of the most significant moments in this case so far. Because the deeper investigators looked into what happened aboard that cruise ship, the more questions they uncovered, and the more difficult those questions became to ignore. Long before federal court hearings, detention orders, and national headlines, there was Anna Keaptainner. And to understand why this case has captured so much attention, you first have to understand what was lost. Anna was only 18 years old. Friends described her as outgoing, ambitious, and full of energy. She was approaching graduation and already thinking about the future. Unlike many teenagers who were still deciding what path to take, Anna had goals. She hoped to join the military and eventually build a career helping others. Those who knew her remember someone who brought positivity wherever she went. She enjoyed spending time with friends, loved being around family, and had the kind of personality that naturally drew people toward her. No one could have imagined that her life would become the center of a federal murder investigation. In November of 2025, Anna joined family members aboard the Carnival Horizon cruise ship. The trip was supposed to be a chance for everyone to relax and spend time together. The massive vessel departed from Miami and carried thousands of passengers through the Caribbean. For most people on board, it was just another vacation. But for one family, it would become a nightmare. At the time, Anna was part of a recently blended family. Her father had remarried, and through that marriage, she gained a stepbrother, 16-year-old Timothy Hudson. That family connection would later become one of the most shocking aspects of the entire case. According to investigators, Anna shared a cabin with Timothy and another younger sibling during portions of the cruise. At first glance, nothing about that arrangement appeared unusual. Families share cabins on cruise ships every day. But investigators now believe that cabin became the location where everything changed. On the evening of November 6th, family members spent time together as passengers across the ship enjoyed restaurants, entertainment, and activities. At some point that evening, Anna returned to the cabin. According to authorities, surveillance footage later showed Timothy Hudson entering the same room. What happened after that is the central question prosecutors hope to answer at trial. Hours passed. The ship continued moving through the Caribbean. Most passengers slept peacefully, unaware that investigators would later focus on the events unfolding inside a single cabin. When federal agents eventually reviewed surveillance footage, they began constructing a detailed timeline. Minute by minute, movement by movement. According to court filings, cameras captured Timothy Hudson entering and leaving the cabin multiple times throughout the evening. One particular moment attracted special attention. Investigators say surveillance footage showed Hudson opening the cabin door and looking carefully in both directions down the hallway before stepping outside. Prosecutors later highlighted this behavior because they believed it appeared different from his other movements that night. Was he simply checking the hallway? Or was he making sure no one was watching? That question will likely become an important issue during trial. But investigators were not finished uncovering details. Another moment later that night would become equally significant. According to federal documents, a younger sibling attempted to enter the cabin during the overnight hours. The child later told investigators that Hudson temporarily prevented him from entering and instructed him to wait outside. At the time, the younger sibling reportedly thought the interaction was unusual, but he had no way of knowing why. Investigators would later argue that this moment fits into a larger timeline they spent months reconstructing. Then came the following morning. A routine cabin service check led to a discovery that immediately changed everything. Anna Keaptainner was found dead. The situation instantly triggered emergency procedures aboard the ship. Crew members alerted authorities. Investigators were contacted. And because of the circumstances surrounding the case, federal agencies quickly became involved. The FBI began collecting evidence almost immediately. Witnesses were interviewed. Electronic records were secured. Surveillance footage was preserved. Every possible detail became important. But as agents worked through the evidence, they realized that the surveillance timeline alone would not answer every question. There were still gaps. There were still unknowns. And there was one critical item investigators desperately needed to locate. Anna's phone. At first, it seemed to have disappeared completely. No one knew where it was. No one knew what happened to it. But investigators would soon discover that the missing phone might reveal far more than anyone expected. In fact, according to prosecutors, the search for that device would eventually uncover one of the most damaging pieces of evidence in the entire case. And when investigators finally traced its path across the ship, the direction it pointed would become impossible to ignore. As investigators continued rebuilding the timeline, they kept returning to one unanswered question. Where was Anna's phone? In modern criminal investigations, phones often tell stories that people cannot. They record movements, preserve conversations, store photographs, and leave behind digital footprints that can survive even when someone tries to erase them. Investigators knew that finding Anna's phone could provide crucial answers. But there was a problem. The device was missing. When Anna's body was discovered, her phone was nowhere to be found. Family members couldn't locate it. Crew members couldn't locate it. And investigators immediately became suspicious. Because in cases like this, missing evidence often becomes just as important as the evidence that remains. Federal agents began examining surveillance footage from the hours after Anna's death. They wanted to know who moved through the ship, where they went, and whether any behavior stood out. That search soon led them to a sequence of events prosecutors now consider extremely important. According to court records, surveillance cameras allegedly captured Timothy Hudson moving through different areas of the ship during the morning after Anna was found. At first glance, the footage appeared ordinary. But investigators were looking at more than just video. They were also analyzing digital location data connected to Anna's missing phone. And when those two pieces of evidence were compared, authorities say something remarkable happened. The phone appeared to move through the ship along a path that closely matched Hudson's movements. Investigators followed the digital trail step by step. Eventually, it led them away from the family's cabin and toward a trash collection area located elsewhere on the vessel. When crew members later searched the location, they reportedly found Anna's phone. But the discovery raised even more questions. The device had allegedly been damaged. According to investigators, someone appeared to have attempted to destroy it before discarding it. For prosecutors, that detail mattered enormously. Because if someone intentionally removed and damaged the phone, the next question becomes obvious. Why? Why take it at all? Why move it across the ship? Why dispose of it? And why attempt to destroy it? These are questions prosecutors are expected to place directly before a jury. They argue that actions taken after a crime can sometimes reveal knowledge of that crime. Defense attorneys, however, will likely challenge those conclusions and argue that investigators are making assumptions based on circumstantial evidence. That disagreement is expected to become a major battleground during trial. But while digital investigators were examining the phone evidence, forensic specialists were working on another critical part of the case: the physical evidence. Following Anna's death, investigators conducted an extensive forensic examination. Samples were collected. Laboratory testing was performed. Experts began analyzing every piece of evidence that might help explain what happened inside the cabin. The results would later become central to the government's case. According to prosecutors, DNA evidence recovered during the investigation linked Timothy Hudson to key forensic findings. Those findings became one of the primary reasons federal prosecutors felt confident pursuing serious charges. For the defense, however, the forensic evidence also created opportunities. Court proceedings revealed the existence of additional DNA findings that defense attorneys may attempt to use when arguing reasonable doubt. And that is where this case becomes more complicated. Because criminal trials are rarely decided by a single piece of evidence. Instead, jurors are asked to evaluate an entire collection of facts: the timeline, witness statements, digital records, forensic findings, behavior before and after an event. And when prosecutors looked at all those elements together, they began developing a theory about what happened. A theory that extended beyond physical evidence. A theory involving motive. Some individuals described behavior they considered concerning. Others spoke about interactions that appeared unusual in hindsight. Investigators examined those claims carefully, because understanding motive can sometimes help explain actions that otherwise seem impossible to understand. Prosecutors are expected to argue that jealousy and obsession played a role in what happened. The defense is expected to challenge that interpretation. And ultimately, it will be up to a jury to decide which explanation is more convincing. But before any jury hears the evidence, another important question had to be answered. Would Timothy Hudson remain free while waiting for trial? Or had the evidence become too serious to ignore? That decision would eventually land in the hands of a federal judge. And after reviewing everything prosecutors presented, the court would make a ruling that completely changed the direction of the case. A ruling that finally sent Timothy Hudson to jail. By the middle of 2026, the Timothy Hudson case had reached a turning point. For months, prosecutors had been building their case behind the scenes. Federal investigators continued reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing for what could become one of the most closely watched criminal trials of the year. But there was still one issue generating enormous debate. Timothy Hudson was not in jail. Despite the seriousness of the allegations, he remained outside custody under court-ordered conditions while the legal process moved forward. For many people following the case, that reality was difficult to understand. How could someone accused of such serious crimes remain free while awaiting trial? The answer largely came down to age. When Hudson was first charged, the case began within the juvenile justice system. Juvenile defendants are often treated differently than adults, and courts must consider additional factors when making decisions about detention. But as prosecutors continued presenting evidence, they pushed for a different approach. Eventually, the case moved toward adult federal court, and that changed everything. The legal stakes became dramatically higher. The potential consequences became more severe, and prosecutors renewed their effort to convince the court that Hudson should no longer remain outside custody. To understand why the judge ultimately agreed, it helps to look at how detention decisions are made. A judge is not deciding guilt or innocence during a detention hearing. That comes later. Instead, the court must answer a different question. Does the defendant present a risk that cannot be adequately managed while awaiting trial? Prosecutors argued that the answer was yes. They pointed to the surveillance footage. They pointed to the digital evidence. They pointed to the forensic findings. And they pointed to what they described as a pattern of behavior that raised serious concerns. The defense disagreed. Hudson had pleaded not guilty. His attorneys argued that allegations are not convictions and that the government still had the burden of proving its case in court. Both sides presented arguments. Both sides challenged each other's conclusions. And then the evidence landed before a federal judge. The court reviewed the materials, examined the allegations, considered the arguments, and ultimately reached a conclusion that would send shockwaves through the case. Timothy Hudson was ordered into custody. The decision immediately became one of the biggest developments since his arrest. But what drew even more attention was the reasoning behind the ruling. According to court documents, the judge expressed serious concerns regarding the nature of the allegations and the evidence presented by prosecutors. The court ultimately determined that continued release was no longer appropriate. That finding transformed the case overnight. For supporters of Anna Keaptainer's family, the ruling represented a significant moment. For the defense, it marked a major setback ahead of trial. But regardless of where people stood, one fact became impossible to ignore. The next chapter would unfold inside a courtroom. And that courtroom battle is expected to be intense. Federal prosecutors will likely spend weeks presenting their case. Jurors could hear testimony from investigators who reconstructed the timeline aboard the Carnival Horizon. Digital experts may explain how electronic evidence was tracked and analyzed. Forensic specialists could be called to discuss laboratory findings and physical evidence. Witnesses connected to the family may provide additional context regarding relationships and interactions leading up to the cruise. Meanwhile, defense attorneys will challenge every major conclusion. They will question interpretations of evidence. They will highlight inconsistencies. They will search for reasonable doubt wherever they believe it exists. Because that is how the justice system works. Two sides, two competing narratives. One jury tasked with determining which version is supported by the evidence. But beyond the legal arguments lies a reality that often gets lost in high-profile criminal cases. Anna Keaptainner never got the opportunity to defend her future. She never got the chance to pursue the plans she had made. She never got to see where life would take her. Everything stopped aboard that cruise ship. And that is ultimately why this case continues to resonate with so many people. It is not simply about evidence. It is not simply about court hearings. It is not simply about legal strategy. It is about a young woman whose life ended far too soon. Now, with Timothy Hudson behind bars and a federal trial approaching, the focus shifts to what happens next. The evidence will be tested. Witnesses will testify. Arguments will be made. And eventually, a jury will decide the outcome. Until then, questions remain. But one thing is certain. The evidence prosecutors presented was powerful enough to convince a federal judge that Timothy Hudson should no longer remain free. And that decision may prove to be one of the most important moments in the entire case. As this case moves closer to trial, it is important to remember something that can easily get lost behind the headlines, the court hearings, and the endless legal arguments. At the center of this story was a young woman who had her entire life ahead of her. Anna Keaptainner wasn't thinking about courtrooms. She wasn't thinking about federal investigations. She was thinking about graduation, her future, her goals, and the next chapter of her life. Like so many young people her age, she had dreams she was still working toward and experiences she had yet to live. Now, those dreams exist only in the memories of the people who loved her. In the months ahead, a jury will hear testimony, review evidence, and decide what happened aboard the Carnival Horizon. Prosecutors will present their case. Defense attorneys will present theirs. And eventually, the legal system will reach its conclusion. But no verdict can change one simple fact. A family lost a daughter. Friends lost someone they cared about. And a future that should have existed was suddenly taken away. As we continue following this case, our goal remains the same: to focus on the facts, follow every major development, and make sure stories like Anna's are never forgotten. If you found this coverage informative, make sure to subscribe to Court of Secrets and turn on notifications so you don't miss any updates as this case moves toward trial. We will continue bringing you the latest developments, the key courtroom moments, and the evidence that could ultimately shape the outcome. Thank you for watching. And above all, remember Anna,